What makes a great story? When George R.R. Martin said a reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies, he was completely right. George R.R. Martin is the author and creator of Game of Thrones, one of the most popular stories of all time. While stories like these are largely just seen as an entertaining way to pass the time, stories can be so much more than that. And sure, good stories are entertaining, but great stories can be powerful. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, come on. A few books and stories aren't going to change my life. She's definitely exaggerating. However, I would argue that that is exactly what they would do. Now let me introduce myself. My name is Leah, and if you couldn't tell, I am a story lover. I'm such a story lover that I'm currently applying to film schools in New York to learn to tell my own. But I'm not just here to tell you why I love stories so much or why they're so important to each and every one of us. I'm here to tell you the difference between a good story and a great story. Over the past few months, I have spent hours reading books, listening to stories, and interviewing both the scientific and emotional aspects of story. Having done all of this research, I have come up with 3 components of a truly great story. Firstly, a great story lets you travel to places you've never been before, or maybe never knew existed. Secondly, a great story makes you feel something. In a world where tragedy is all too common, we often become desensitized to true emotion. Good stories show us how to feel again. Finally, a great story should teach you something. Whether it teaches you something about yourself, someone else, or just a life lesson, you should walk away from a story having gained a new perspective. Let's dive into these 3 points. Point number 1. A great story takes you to places you've never been before. I don't know about any of you, but I've always dreamed of traveling and seeing the world. While this is a dream of mine and so many others, it is not always realistic to dream about. Really traveling the world requires money, maybe time off work, and no one at home depending on you to be there. It's very rare for all the necessary conditions to really travel to be met. Stories allow you to travel and see the world, all while just sitting at home. While this is incredible, there is so much more stories can do. Not only can you go to real places you've dreamed of, like Paris or Italy, but you can go to fictional places and magical places. During my research, I had the amazing opportunity to speak with local author Virginia McGregor. She gave me so much insight into how we can travel to new places through stories. One thing she said that really stuck with me was this: I want the reader to completely inhabit the world and see it vividly. She told me about how when she reads a story, she isn't sitting in her bed reading words on a page. She's there, in the story, experiencing it with the characters. She spoke about how this provides an escape and lets anyone who needs to escape for the real world, even if just for a little while. She said, "You're allowed to live in 2 worlds. You have your normal everyday life, and then you have this parallel life." This aspect of escaping reality and traveling to new places is crucial in the making of a truly great story. Point number 2. A great story should make you feel something. When speaking with Mrs. McGregor, she told me that stories remind us how to feel in a world that is so completely desensitized to true emotion. We live in a world where death, tragedy, and disasters happen almost every day. Because of this, we feel less and less emotion because we are so used to the tragedies, while the impacts of them remain the same. We become numb and feel far away from real-world current events. During my research, I spoke to teenagers about how recent tragedies made them feel. Almost everyone I talked to had the same reaction. They all said, in some way or another, that while the tragedy saddened them, they aren't as affected as they used to be. They happen too often. Stories teach us how to feel again by expressing emotions and feelings that can't be communicated any other way. It's almost ironic to me. The fictional world can sometimes feel more real than reality. When you absorb yourself into this new world, you attach yourself to these characters and feel more deeply connected to them than you might to the tragedies of the real world. Point number 3. We've reached our final point. A story that is truly great teaches you something. It could teach you something about yourself that you never knew. It could teach you something about someone else that makes you see them differently. Or it could teach you a life lesson that you take with you till your grave. There's a quote by Mr. Rogers, who was a famous television host, that really impacted me. He said, "Frankly, there isn't anyone you can't learn to love once you've heard their story." This is a very true statement that, if learned by everyone, could truly change the world. Everyone has their own story, and it's up to us to get to know people and their story before we label them. One example of this is Disney villains. You watch Sleeping Beauty and walk away believing that Maleficent is a bad person. No questions asked, no hesitation. But then you watch Maleficent in her own movie and you hear her full story. After you experience her story, you realize she isn't a bad person after all, and you end up rooting for her. This is a prime example of how learning someone's story teaches you so much more about them than just how they appear on the surface. Stories don't just teach us about others, however. Stories can also teach you about yourself. One way stories do this is turning what is seen as weaknesses into a strength. There may be something you're really self-conscious about, but you read a story where a character has this same struggle, the same issue that you do, and they use it to their advantage. Mrs. McGregor gave me even more insight to this idea. She told me that a key to writing real, relatable characters is using their weaknesses and showing the strengths within them. She gave me many examples of how she does this. She takes a character who is really reckless and realizes they're also brave. She takes a character who is cold and analytical and realizes they're also practical and capable of making hard decisions. You walk away from this fictional story with a very real lesson that changes you for the better. When you finish a story and you have gained a new perspective, you know that you have experienced a truly great story. I hope that after this talk, you are not only able to tell the difference between a good and a great story, but I hope you're encouraged to go and explore new stories that could change your life.